Hello and greetings from Colorado Springs. My name is Lance Kohler and I'm the broker owner of the Cornerstone real estate team. Today I'd like to talk to you about 6 key lease clauses. If you are an independent rental owner or a do-it-yourself landlord, you want to make sure that you address these 6 clauses in your lease. First clause I'd like to discuss is allocation of rents. And what I'm really talking about there is allocation of the payments that you receive. So you may have some additional expenses that the tenant's responsible for. There may be processing fees or admin fees, maintenance, repairs, or late fees or utilities that the tenant is also responsible for paying. So in your lease, you want to address how those expenses are charged to the tenant and who's responsible for paying and in what order. So that when you receive a payment from the tenant, you're able to allocate that payment to the utility expense or the maintenance expense prior to allocating it to the rent. This is important because you don't want the tenant just to pay rent and not pay for those other expenses that they're responsible for. You should also have a paragraph that discusses the security deposits. That should be somewhat self-evident. You want to detail how much the security deposit is, where it's being held, who's holding it, and under what circumstances and what timeline you will return it to the tenant at the conclusion of the lease. Most states and localities, or some localities, have specific requirements that tell you exactly how much time you have to return that security deposit to the tenant. For example, in Colorado, we need to provide a tenant with their security deposit and an accounting of how any funds were used from the security deposit, if we've applied that security deposit to any expenses within 30 days at the end of the lease, unless your lease specifies a longer timeline. And then in Colorado, at least, you have up until 60 days after the end of the lease to return that security deposit and provide an accounting to the tenant. You should also have a clause that discusses maintenance. In a previous video, I talked about some maintenance aspects, who's responsible for lawn care, who's responsible for landscaping or snow removal. But in your lease, you should also address consumables. Who's responsible for furnace filters? Who replaces them? And who's responsible for buying them? Is that the owner or is it the tenant? You may have water filters or a humidifier filter, and those are all consumables, and so you should address how those are being handled. Is the owner or the tenant responsible for replacing burnout light bulbs? In addition to that, you should also address broken windows in your maintenance clause, and you should also address fair wear and tear. And what I mean by that is, at least in Colorado, probably in most states, a tenant is not responsible or can't be held responsible for fair wear and tear on the property. But our lease, we specify that dirt and grime is never considered fair wear and tear, and therefore the tenant is responsible for cleaning. The 4th clause you should have is late fees. So your lease is going to address the rent, how much the rent is and when it's due. You should also specify in your lease when the rent is late and when late fees start to accrue and how much they are. If you have a one-time late fee, or if you have a daily late fee, or if you have a escalation, so 10 days after the rent's due, there's a late fee, you want to specify that and let the tenant know how much those late fees are. The 5th clause you should have is to address the right to entry. That should be detailed in your lease. You as the owner have ownership of the property. By signing the lease, you have given the tenant possession of the property. The tenant has the right to quiet enjoyment of the property. And so what you want to detail is what notification is required prior to you coming to the property. So if you need to check on the property, how much notification do you need to get the tenant prior to setting a time or a date for coming to the property, if you're going to check on the furnace filter or check on a repair that was done. And so typically you want to state that you have the right to check on the property and let them know that you're going to give them reasonable notification, which is typically 24 hours or more, and you want it to be done in a reasonable time of day, typically during daylight hours. And you also should address in that clause what to do in cases of emergency. So if you're driving by the property and you see water flowing out the front door, you want to be able to go into the property immediately to protect the property and make sure there's no further damage. So you should specify that in this clause in your lease. Lastly, but maybe most important, is the severability clause. Why do I say that's the most important? Because if any portion or clause in your lease is determined to be not legally enforceable or invalid, a severability clause will prevent the entire document from being determined invalid or not legally enforceable. So a severability clause applies to many different types of contracts, but you want to make sure you have a severability clause in your lease. So to recap, those are 6 clauses that as an independent rental owner or a do-it-yourself landlord, we highly recommend that you address specifically in your lease. I hope that this information was of value to you. We post regularly on our social media accounts with information and articles similar to this that is of value to an independent rental owner. So if you like what you see here today, please like and follow us on our Facebook, our Instagram, or our Twitter accounts. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.